happened a few years ago. During that time, I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of my building. Overall, the apartment complex was nice and I liked it a lot. However, I only lived there for 1 year, the term of my lease, before moving to a different place. This event took place towards the end of my lease. It was nighttime and I was home alone. My living room was at the back of the apartment with the kitchen at the front. As it got late, I planned to go to bed. It was around 11 o'clock. I went over to my living room window, which was a large sliding glass door that opened to a small balcony. As usual, I went to close the blinds before bed. While doing this, I glanced out into the parking lot, where my car was parked. To my surprise, I noticed someone standing next to my car. This caught my attention, so I kept watching. It was a man, and he appeared to be fiddling with my car. I saw him try to open the door, but it was locked. I watched as he looked into the windows. Concerned, I opened the sliding door, stepped onto the balcony, and shouted, "That's my car!" The man looked up at me. I expected him to stop what he was doing and leave, but after staring at me for a few moments, he didn't say anything. I yelled again, "What are you doing?" Still, he didn't answer. After a few more seconds of staring, he walked away from my car, but toward my building. I watched him until he disappeared near the front doors of the apartment complex, out of my sight. I wasn't sure if he had entered the building, but it seemed like he might have. It was strange. If someone was trying to break into a car, I wouldn't expect them to live there. I thought it would be some passerby. Even though I was relieved he left my car alone, I was suspicious about him possibly being in the building. I didn't recognize him, but I also didn't know many people who lived there. I closed the blinds and continued getting ready for bed. About 2 minutes later, I heard someone trying to open my apartment door. I walked to the living room and looked at the door. It was locked. After a few quiet moments, I peeked through the peephole and saw the same man who had been outside near my car. I didn't open the door, but I kept watching. He stood there briefly, then knocked. I didn't answer. Eventually, the man turned and walked away. I was left with so many questions. Who was this guy? Why was he at my car? And why was he now at my door? Despite my unease, I went to bed. After that, I only saw the man one other time. One afternoon, I arrived home from work, parked my car in the lot, and entered the building. I got into the elevator to go up to my floor, and just as the doors were about to close, I saw the same man down the hallway. He was walking towards the elevator, but after he saw me, he sped up, almost running, trying to catch it before the doors shut. Luckily, the elevator doors closed before he could reach it. I went up to my floor and quickly went inside my apartment. The man never came to my door again, and I didn't see him after that. I only lived there for 2 more months before moving out, and I never saw him again. This happened when I was much younger. I believe I was about 12 years old or so. I remember that one night, I found myself home alone. My parents were gone someplace, and my older sister had gone to her friend's house. It didn't happen very often that I would be home by myself, so I remember thinking how strange it felt that the house was so quiet with nobody else there. I was in my bedroom doing homework, which I remember I had a lot of. It was about 8 o'clock or so and dark outside when there was a knock at the front door. Immediately, it seemed strange to me. We didn't get many door-to-door salesmen or anything like that. Still, I got up from my chair, left the room, and walked over to the front door. I remember that I didn't even bother to look out of a window to see who it was. I just opened the front door. A man stood on the front step and said, "Hi." He was somewhat tall and thin from what I remember and had darkish hair. The man asked if my parents were home, and I said no. I figured he was some kind of salesman or something. After I told him my parents were not home, though he did not immediately leave. He kept standing there and then asked if he could come inside. I told him no. The guy didn't say anything right away after that. So I just closed the door and locked it. I thought it was really weird. Then I went to the window and looked out. I saw the man walking back down the driveway. Afterward, I went back to my bedroom to continue my homework. It didn't take long for me to get really focused. But then, about 10 minutes later, I heard another noise. It sounded like someone was trying to open the back door of the house. I didn't get up to go look, though. I was too scared. I stayed in my bedroom and listened. The noises didn't last very long, and soon, everything became quiet. That's when I decided to get up and look. I didn't really know what was going on at the time. I was hoping it was just my imagination or something with a logical explanation. But I think I also knew that was kind of unlikely. When I left my bedroom, I went down the hallway towards the living room. I then entered the dining room at the back of the house. It was there that I noticed, through a window, the same man who had been at the door. He was now standing in the backyard. I quickly turned and ran back to my bedroom. I don't think the man saw me. When I got back to my room, I grabbed the phone and called the police. I reported the guy for trying to enter the house and then hid in my bedroom. I remember going under my covers and not hearing or seeing anything for what felt like a long time. Eventually, the police arrived. They actually found the guy hiding in the backyard, behind the shed. I really thought he would have left. I didn't know who the guy was, and neither did my parents or sister. I'm really glad he wasn't able to get inside the house. I live by myself in a house a little ways outside the city. This happened a couple of years ago. One day, I got home from work a little later than usual. It was sometime past 10 o'clock, and I was really tired. After getting inside the house, I pretty much started getting ready for bed right away. I remember being in the bathroom across the hall from my bedroom when I heard a door downstairs close. Instantly, I was creeped out. I froze and listened for any other sounds, but there was just silence. After a moment, I left the bathroom and went downstairs to see what it was. When I got downstairs, I saw nothing. I noticed that I had left a window partly open and figured the wind had blown the door shut. This was something that happened from time to time. I felt much better after that. I closed the window and headed back upstairs. I finished getting ready for bed and went into my bedroom. Once the lights were out and I closed my eyes to sleep, I heard another noise. It sounded like someone walking around downstairs. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid because of what I had heard earlier. After all, the sound was faint, and it could have been anything. But it continued, and soon, I realized the sounds were getting louder. Then I realized it sounded like someone was coming up the stairs. That's when it hit me. There was definitely someone in my house. I started to panic. I immediately jumped out of bed, ran to my bedroom door, closed it, and locked it. Then I grabbed my cell phone. I had no idea how, but someone had gotten inside. As I scrambled to dial 911, I heard footsteps approaching down the hallway. I froze, too terrified to make a sound, hoping the intruder wouldn't hear me. The 911 operator answered, but I didn't say anything. I then heard the intruder stop right outside my door and try the handle. It didn't open because it was locked. After a moment, the person turned and walked back down the hallway. Once the footsteps faded, I finally found my voice and told the operator what was happening. I stayed locked in my room, still on the line with 911. The police arrived incredibly quickly, probably within 3 or 4 minutes. While I waited, I didn't hear any more noises. When the police searched my house and yard, they didn't find anyone. However, the door was unlocked, and I was 99% sure it had been locked when I went to bed. I never found out who broke into my house or how they got in. My best guess is that they entered while I was at work, probably earlier in the evening, just before I arrived home. The most likely way they got in was through the window I had left open. It's ironic that seeing the open window initially made me feel better, thinking the wind had closed the door, when it was probably the way the intruder entered. Since then, I haven't had any problems like this, and I'm hoping it stays that way. This happened back when I was 12 years old. It was summertime and I was at home by myself. Both of my parents were at work and this was probably in the late morning. I just remember that it was a really nice day outside. So I went into the front yard and was reading a book in a chair we had out there. After probably an hour of this, I noticed a car driving down our street. A few cars had already gone by that I had noticed. We lived on a quiet street that didn't get much traffic, mostly just people who lived there. This particular car was going very slow. It was a black 4-door sedan, and after passing by, It went further down my street and then out of sight. I didn't think much of it, but only about a minute later, I saw the car coming back from the other direction. When it passed by our house, it seemed to slow down even more than before. I didn't recognize the car, and I couldn't help but feel a little suspicious. The car eventually moved on and left the street. At this point, I hoped it was just someone who was lost, so I stayed outside and continued reading. However, less than 5 minutes later, the car was back. Once again, it drove by very slowly. I had a bad feeling about it, but luckily, the car passed me by and continued down the street. When it did, I decided to go inside the house. After getting inside, I went to the kitchen to get something to drink. I was about to head to my bedroom, but stopped at the front window first. That's when I saw the same car sitting in our driveway. Couldn't believe it. The car was parked at the back end of the driveway, and while I couldn't see who was behind the wheel, I could tell there was someone in the driver's seat. It appeared to be a man. I watched the car, but it just sat there. Nobody got out. I didn't really know what to do, but I soon moved away from the window. I walked around the house, though I don't remember why. When I returned to the front window, I noticed the car was now empty. The man had left. I didn't know where he had gone. I looked at the front step, but no one was there. He wasn't going to knock at the door. I went to another front window and looked out, but saw nothing there either. At that moment, I was trying to figure out what he could possibly be doing. I couldn't think of any logical explanation. I decided to go back to my bedroom. When I got inside, I saw the man standing just outside my window. We locked eyes for a brief moment before I quickly ran away. I ran into the kitchen to get the phone and call 911. As I grabbed the phone, I saw the man running away past another window. He then went around the house and back to his car. While I was calling the police, I could hear him driving away. I completed the call anyway. The police came out to our house, and I told them everything I could. My parents were called and came home from work early. It was one of the craziest moments of my life. I'm really glad the man didn't get inside. After that, I never saw him again. I live alone in a small house. I've lived here for 5 years now, and I would describe the neighborhood as average. By far, the scariest thing to happen took place not too long after I first moved in. I'd been living here for maybe 6 months. One night, I was woken up out of nowhere by a loud banging at my front door. I remember being very confused at first, but once I came to my senses and realized what was going on, I looked at the clock. It was nearly 2 in the morning. I got out of bed, and the loud pounding was still going on. I had absolutely no idea what this could possibly be. After leaving my bedroom and walking over to the front door, the banging suddenly stopped. Still, I went the rest of the way to the front door and looked out the window. When I did, I noticed that no one was there. I opened the door and looked around. I saw nothing. Nobody in the street, nobody in my driveway, nothing. It was very weird because whoever had just been here seemed like they really wanted me to open the door. I stayed up for a little while after that and nothing else happened. Soon, I was able to go back to bed. I thought maybe it was just a mistake, but I still wondered about it all day the next day. Well, the very next night, something else happened. I was woken up in the middle of the night again. This time, there was no knocking. I remember hearing the sound of a car horn honking. It was coming from outside somewhere, but I couldn't tell exactly where. It sounded close by, though. After it continued for a while, I got out of bed and once again headed to the front of my house. I was getting closer to the sound, and when I got there, I looked out the window. I saw a car sitting in my driveway. I didn't recognize it, but the horn was honking over and over. Obviously, with it being nighttime, I couldn't tell who was behind the wheel. I went to the front door and opened it. As soon as I did, the car suddenly stopped honking and drove away really fast. I didn't get a look at the license plate or anything. After the car drove away, I was left very confused. I figured it was the same person who had been banging on my door the previous night. But why? I really didn't know. The car didn't return that night, and once more I went back to bed. The next day, I wondered if I would be woken up again. I thought about going to the police, but ultimately, I didn't do it. That night, I wasn't woken up. I thought things were back to normal. However, as I was leaving for work, I noticed a note taped to my front door. I picked it up and looked at it. It was handwritten and it said, "I will be back next week." This really creeped me out. Someone was messing with me for some reason. After that, I did go to the police. I showed them the note and reported everything. They said they would look into it but thought it might just be a prank. I was really nervous the following week, but nothing happened. I'm glad nothing happened, but I'm still confused. Since then, nothing strange has occurred. I'm not sure if it was just some kind of sick joke or what, but I'm glad nothing more ever came of it. I am a female corrections officer, prison guard, or CO, in a state with a relatively high number of death row inmates. However, few executions are actually carried out. I used to work for a large county, but I work with a different agency now. This county was my first CO job years ago, and before that, I worked in retail and customer service while studying criminal justice, so I was really green. I used to be very liberal. I'm still liberal about a lot of things, but the job changes your perspective for most people. One thing that I used to believe very strongly was that no human being could be truly evil. This particular county jail is one of the oldest in the country, so parts of it have a totally linear layout. What I mean is that you have a long stretch of corridor with cells on either side, and the COs have to walk up and down to supervise the inmates. I am actually giving enough information for anyone with good Google skills to figure that out. As you can imagine, these linear layouts are not in style anymore because you cannot see every cell at the same time, but every inmate can see you. I have to say that units like this are extremely creepy too. I'm going to call this corridor the condos. We didn't call it that, but I do not want to share the exact term, which is specific to the jail. Less than 10 years ago, a quadruple stabbing homicide happened not far from where I grew up. The murderer, Michaels, described it as a butchering. He killed his former girlfriend, her family, and their neighbor because the neighbor came over when he heard the screams. When the police found Michaels soaked in blood and asked him what happened, he said, "It's obvious. I just killed everyone." The cop said that he seemed completely emotionless when he said it. At that time, I had only been a CO for about 4 months, and our facility received him as a pretrial detainee. Now, obviously, he wasn't our first or only murderer, but the nature of the crime, stabbings, indicated a more dangerous personality than a shooting, for one thing, and his lack of remorse was horrifying. He was considered a volatile inmate, so we placed him in an observation cell in the middle of the condos where a CO could always keep an eye on him. He would stand at his glass door in silence most of the day, just watching everyone. I swear he only really spoke when he had visits. He actually had a full visit list of goth girls who would come in and swear they were in love with him. I don't know if this means anything, but his ex was a big girl, and he used to draw pictures of the overweight female COs. For reference, he was skinny and white with brown hair. One day, I was working as a utilities officer, basically a floater who relieves people for breaks and helps out as needed. At this jail, utilities officers also got away with a ton of downtime and BSing. I was hanging out at one end of the condos, where you could look down to see a lot of the jail, talking to another officer on duty. As they say, there are no secrets in jail. Plus, I was aware that there were points throughout the jail where you could hear very well into neighboring cells, that sort of thing. We were being pretty quiet, though, and we stood a good 50 yards from Michael's observation cell. Also, you have to imagine it would be difficult to stand in the observation cell and press your face against the glass to see the people standing at a right angle so far from you. I was telling the CO a funny story about my weekend, which I wouldn't do out on a correctional unit nowadays. It wasn't anything too personal either. It was a long story involving my fiancée at the time. I wrapped up talking to the CO because I had to go to a gate to relieve another officer for chow, and I had to pass Michael's cell. I didn't like walking past it because he stood there and stared at you, and back then I wasn't so good at hiding my nervousness. He always had his head slightly tilted down, so you could see white under the irises of his eyes. Again, rarely saying a word, but today was different. I took one step past his door, and I heard him say, "𝐐𝐿𝐿, in a barely audible whisper. I didn't even know he knew my name. Yes, our last names are on our uniforms, but I was never his primary officer and we never interacted. It caught me off guard, so instead of ignoring it, I stopped in my tracks and backpedaled to the door. He pointed to his mouth and I leaned in to listen. His eyes looked so dark. I remember I felt hypnotized. He proceeded to recite, word for word, the story I had just quietly told the officer at the end of the condos less than 2 minutes before, even copying the sound of my voice down to a subtle lisp. This seemed to go on forever. I felt like we were the only two there. Number 22 millimeters of glass protecting me. Just a 5-foot-tall female and a murderer. I remember thinking for the first time about another human being. This is evil and unfixable. Finally, I said, "Sir, did you need something?" He started to laugh hysterically, and I walked away. Working here, I have been assaulted by other inmates. I've had piss thrown in my eyes. People play mind games with me constantly. I've met some damn good lip readers too, but this was like something else. Now, I work at a maximum security institution where I babysit sex offenders, murderers, and pedophiles. I don't know how to make it make sense to you, but this was the one and only time in my life where I felt, inside of me, like I was dealing with something not human. Michaels is in another institution now. He is on death row. He refuses to appeal. He made it clear to the press that this decision is not out of remorse. He has none. He just doesn't give a shit, and it's most logical in his mind for him to die. This story takes place in a very small town in the northeast region of the United States. During the summer before I went off to college in 2015. After I graduated from high school, my parents decided to move to a smaller, more affordable house about 45 minutes north into the mountains. We stayed in my childhood home because the public schools in my area were the best in the state. My parents really valued my education. I ended up attending an amazing university and now have an incredible career because of my excellent education. As most people in the US know, excellent public education often comes with higher property taxes. My parents eventually reached a point where they could no longer afford the taxes on their 4,000 square foot home and decided to sell it shortly after I graduated. Their new home was humble but sat on a beautiful piece of land on the side of a mountain. The trees were always lush and green, and there wasn't much wildlife around. They didn't have many neighbors either, as their driveway stretched about 1.5 miles. This was where they chose to live after I went off to college. In August of 2015, we moved into this new house. I wasn't planning to stay long, as I was getting ready to head off to college for the first time as a freshman. We decided to have a little housewarming party with a bunch of family friends and my best friend at the time. My dad was manning the barbecue, my mom was making drinks, and we were all playing with our dogs. It was a great time, and everyone had a lot of fun. My dad had built a brick fire pit in the backyard. To set the scene, the pit was about 30 feet from the back patio door, and we had a picnic table and some seating around it. Behind the seating was the tree line. It was so dark at night that you needed a flashlight to see even 10 feet ahead. With the fire pit lit, you couldn't see anyone unless they were either sitting right next to you or directly across from the fire. My best friend decided to stay the night, and we asked my dad if we could make s'mores. Since it was getting a little chilly, as it often does in the late summer in the Northeast at night, my parents left us outside with my dog, Nino. Nino was a huge 100-pound black lab pit bull mix. He was incredibly loyal and had been trained by my dad. Nino was our protector, fast, strong, and always alert when something went bump in the night. Side note, Nino passed away a week before I got married in 2022. He was 17 years old and lived an adventurous life with my parents, hunting squirrels, laying in the sun, and running amok. That night, Nino was lying between us, facing the tree line, while my best friend sat to my right. Our backs were to the dark, dense trees. Our first mistake. We were laughing, joking, eating s'mores, and talking about the future, generally excited about heading off to college together. She decided to play some music, and we relaxed, feeling content and at ease. It was a perfect summer night, until Nino started growling. His ears perked up, and his head cocked to the side. Then he sat up and continued growling. My friend and I exchanged glances, thinking Nino had probably just seen a stray animal or something harmless. The area was known for deer, and coyotes or wolves were rare. Since Nino had been trained to help my dad hunt deer, we assumed he had spotted a buck or fawn in the distance. We went back to singing along to the music and talking about our fall 2015 class schedule. Our second mistake. We didn't call for my dad. We didn't think it was a real problem until Nino started barking, loud and vicious this time. He stood up and began barking, as if warning us of something beyond the tree line that we couldn't see. The fire obscured our view. My best friend paused the music, turned on her phone's flashlight, and began walking towards the tree line with Nino still growling at her side. She shined the light into the woods and froze. There, peering from behind a tree, was a man. He was wearing a green shirt and green pants, standing around 5 feet 11 inches with glasses. We screamed and ran as fast as we could inside, leaving the fire unattended and the man lurking behind the tree. We crashed through the front door, breathless, with Nino trailing behind. My mom, startled, was washing dishes and talking to my dad when we interrupted, panicked, and told them what had just happened. My dad immediately grabbed his shotgun and headlamp and rushed outside with Nino. My mom gathered us in the living room, shut off all the lights, locked the doors, and called 911. My best friend and I sat trembling, waiting for something, anything to happen. We never heard gunshots or screaming. After a few minutes, my dad returned inside. The police were already on their way, as my mom had spoken to the 911 operator. Living in a small town in the mountains meant we didn't have our own police force. We relied on state police. Within minutes, not only had officers arrived, but a SWAT team and even a helicopter had been deployed to search the area. Terrified doesn't even begin to describe how we felt. Inside, the officers asked my best friend and me to describe the man, his appearance, what he was wearing, and any identifying marks. We told them about his green outfit and glasses. The officers passed on our description and the search began in earnest. After about 25 minutes, 2 officers knocked on our door again. This time, they explained that a convicted felon had escaped from a prison 20 miles away, and they suspected he was lurking in the woods behind our house. The man's green outfit matched the standard prison uniform. Though they hadn't found him after the search, they were sure he was still nearby. For the next few nights, the police stationed a patrol car outside our house. My dad kept his shotgun close, and we all slept together in the living room. A few days later, the officers knocked on our door again to tell us the fugitive had been captured. We were safe. They advised us to install security cameras and take precautions, which we did, spending about $10,000 on cameras and fencing for the backyard. I guess you never know what will happen or what goes bump in the night. I'm a 21-year-old male. It was July 4th, 2019. I live in Kansas, USA. At the time, I worked as a corrections officer at a maximum security prison on the night shift. The cell house I was in charge of was the maximum general population, 1 man to a cell. This is where the worst of the worst are, murderers and anything else you can imagine, the overall worst of society. Before work, I was doing the typical American 4th of July thing. Grilling, blowing up fireworks, having a beer or two, and enjoying time with my now wife and family. My wife kept telling me to call in sick and take the day off without pay. I said no because we were a little behind on bills, but I really wish I had listened to her. As the night went on, it came time for us to leave my mom's place and for me to go home and get ready for work. I dropped my wife off at home. Her car was broken down, so she was stuck at home for the night, got ready, and left. As I drove to work, about an hour away, I watched the fireworks going off all around. Felt sad. I had never worked on the 4th before. After I got to work and gathered all of my equipment, I went into my cell house, and everything seemed like business as usual. Inmates were showered and locked up. I got my night cleaning crew out to clean the rest of the cell house, and I met up with my partner for the night in the station to get our briefing from the last shift. Fast forward an hour or so into my shift, and now it's around 12:30 a.m. Another officer came into the cell house, so now there were 3 of us. This happened often on the night shift since there wasn't much to do except rounds every half hour or so. Out of nowhere, we heard an inmate laughing, like a witch's cackle. It was strange, but nothing alarming. Drugs were a major problem in that facility and still are, as far as I know. After a few more cackles, I decided to see who was making the sound in case they were high. I checked all 200 inmates, nothing. Only a few were even awake. So, I brushed it off and went back to my office. My partner and the other officer asked if there was anyone whose cell needed to be searched. I couldn't think of anyone suspicious, so I checked all the cells again to see if I could smell smoke or find anything unusual. As I walked along the second-story cell run, I found an inmate acting weird. He was in bed, facing the wall, talking to himself, common among inmates with minor mental issues. I figured he was high because when he turned to look at me, he told me to fuck off. I was going to leave him alone, but the disrespect changed my mind. It was now 12:40 a.m. on July 5th. I went back to the office and told the other two officers which cell he was in and that I wanted it searched. Cell 218. The cell house layout has 100 cells per level. From the officer station, you can see the north side of both the first and second floors, but you can't see the south side unless you walk 50 feet over. Picture the movie Shawshank Redemption type cell house, except instead of seeing cells across, you just see a wall. The cells are back to back. As the officers went to pull him out of his cell for the search, I stood on the ground floor, watching. I wanted the inmate on the ground, not the second floor, as only a handrail protected the edge. The inmate took forever to get out of his cell. He came out wearing only shorts and a do-rag, no sandals, despite taking 5 minutes to exit. That made me nervous. He was a 6-foot-tall, 250-pound, muscle-bound guy. Definitely had size on us. From the ground, I called out, offering for him to come down to use the phone, check his email or commissary. He declined, which was unusual, and raised red flags. He watched them search his cell from the control panel box, alarming as he could have easily ambushed them. To keep them safe, I went upstairs to him. He was standing at the top of the stairs, near the handrails. He knew I was the officer in charge and the only one who had seen him talking to himself. He asked why I was searching his cell. I lied, saying it wasn't personal, just a quota I had to fill for cell searches. He seemed uneasy, pacing back and forth. Then, I saw something shiny, the Samsung logo reflecting off the light. He had a cell phone. I called over the radio for 2 additional officers. The inmate didn't seem to notice. Soon, my supervisors responded, and 2 more officers were on their way. Side note, at this time, only segregation officers had protective vests. Out of the 5 of us now present, only 1 had a vest, and that wasn't me. When South and McMormick arrived, I told the inmate to turn around and cuff up. He angrily asked why. I didn't answer at first, but eventually said, "I can see the cell phone in your do-rag. You're not supposed to have that." The inmate's face turned from defeated to enraged. He reached up, not for the phone, but for a 6-inch sharpened metal rod, wrapped in ripped fabric as a handle. Everything froze. I knew I was going to die. Then time moved again. The inmate, twice my size, charged at me, thrusting the weapon repeatedly. I barely managed to block his attacks to my abdomen, but he aimed higher. I felt him make contact with my chest. I had just been stabbed. "Spray him," I yelled. McMormick was already spraying the 9 𝐐𝐿𝐴 OC spray. South grabbed the inmate from behind, pulling him back as McMormick sprayed. I didn't realize I had also been sprayed. I turned and ran past the cells and the panel box, coughing as I ran. When I turned to look, South was wrestling with the inmate, both gagging from the OC spray. Sheffield, hearing the commotion, came running out and helped. The inmate grabbed South by the vest, trying to throw him over the edge, but South dropped to his knees in time. I grabbed my shoulder mic, screaming, "Level a response to Charlie 2, now." More officers arrived. The lieutenant came to me, noticing the blood on my arm. He made me lift my shirt and examine my wounds. I was rushed to the ER. Luckily, my injuries weren't too bad. A stab wound in my chest that hit a rib, sparing my lung, and 3 more on my arm and hand. Out of 37 plunges, it's safe to say I'm lucky to be here. I didn't sleep for 2 days after the event, and I still have nightmares. I openly carry a gun now. After my attack, I was forced to resign for safety reasons. Now, all mass prison officers in the state have protective vests. None of my colleagues talk to me anymore. I feel abandoned, except for one friend from that facility, my sergeant, who wasn't there that night. Court is coming soon, where the inmate will face 3 additional charges of attempted murder. It turns out he was a shot caller for the Crips gang.